they're not written to be linear. They're written to be dived in and played around in.
Bigger view of teaching was, I think, one of the principles behind the design of the portfolio, at least as Dan and I have understood and pursued them.
Dan Bernstein. I'm at the University, or was at the University of Kansas. I was the director of the Center for Teaching Excellence for a dozen years, and my academic position was in the psychology department.
I'm Pat Hutchings. I'm a senior scholar with something called the Bayview Alliance and also with the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment.
A number of us were engaged in inquiry into our students' learning through a project that Pat was directing, peer review of teaching, and that morphed into a project at the Carnegie Foundation. And we were intrigued by the notion that the inquiry into student learning had some parallels to the scholarly inquiries in research or other areas. And the idea was, well, how can you capture that spirit of asking a question, trying something out, looking at what happens, and then learning from it. Mm-hmm. And a guy named Bill Serbin from the University of Wisconsin, La Crosse, had written an article in which he described that process, and he called that a course portfolio, because it was inquiry into the actions of a course. Mm-hmm. Well, we basically used materials that Pat and colleagues had developed for the peer review project. You start with a narrative description of the context for your course. Pick an assignment, some way in which students demonstrate their understanding. Share that assignment, share examples of the student's work on the assignment, and then you would talk with a colleague about it. So the first thing you have is the context. Here's the thing you want them to do. And then after we had done that for a while, then we began to ask, well, how can I have them do something better? How can I make a change, an innovation? And so the next phase was, okay, here's what I'm going to do differently the next time I teach it. And then I'll look again at that assignment to see if the way students are responding to it has become deeper or richer or better by whatever standards I've articulated.
Teaching had been sort of construed too narrowly. So when people thought about reviewing one another's teaching, they thought about watching Dan teach in the class on Tuesday from 9 to 10. But in fact, teaching encompasses a broad range of sort of activities and tasks. You got to design the course. Yeah, you got to think about what happens on Tuesday. You need to be looking at student learning, which was a piece that was missing. And then hopefully you look at the whole thing together in a reflective mode and think about where it might take you next. So bigger view of teaching was, I think, one of the principles behind the design of the portfolio, at least as Dan and I have understood and pursued them.
And the use of the term portfolio captures the notion that these things collect artifacts from the course.
Right.
It's not just a narrative description, a teaching philosophy, but there are examples of what the students read, the assignments you gave them, the ways in which you evaluated it, copies of the feedback you gave them, so that there are these artifacts of the process in addition to simply a narrative. Well, I got interested because I got an invitation to a multiple university project that Pat was leading with Lee Schulman. And then at the end of the first year of that, I came back and said to the academic leaders, this is terrific stuff. How do we get this to happen? And the vice provost threw a flyer from FIPSI across the table to me. It was a division of the Department of Education. So we'll write a grant. The usual university response. So I did. And for many years after that, with different support, was able to provide a minor thank you note for faculty members to come and participate in a 2-week summer seminar, and then to continue to meet with a peer partner over the course of the academic year. Initially, I found a few people whose work was just spectacularly good and that I wanted to share. So Holly Storkel in speech communications did some great work, and I invited her to write it up in this way. Lisa Fries in engineering, biomedical engineering, was doing wonderful work. And once we had 2 or 3 of them to look at, then it was possible for others to say, oh, that's a really nice way to represent my teaching. And I've learned from reading that. So the key was having a few good examples, and then it just sort of snowballed because people wanted to become part of that group.
You know, there are all these cliches about faculty who depend on, decades-old sets of yellow notes, and there are some people out there like that, we know that. But what we also know from experience and some more systematic research is that most faculty are in the process of changing their teaching all the time. And the portfolio, I think people latched onto this idea in part because they saw it as a way to do that in a more systematic way that's still not onerous. It's simple, small steps, but thinking about documenting what they do in a way that will help inform the next iteration, that's a pretty good approach for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So an appealing one.
People would do it once, but then we realized people wanted to do an innovation and keep track of it.
Yeah.
So we called the basic year the benchmark portfolio. And then if they did it a second year and then incorporated it too, we called that an inquiry portfolio. So it was just a small step, treating your teaching as intellectual work of an inquiry into how to help students learn.
Well, I do think that's been the big question. How do you make them useful? Clearly they're useful to me if it's my portfolio, for all the reasons we've been indicating. Why should I invest in reading someone else's portfolio? And what would I get from it? I think part of the answer to that lies in understanding the structure of these things. As with any genre, you have to kind of know what it is. It's a sonnet. It's a course portfolio. And so helping people understand the structure, I think, is a first step. And then I think, there are some interesting questions about how people learn from each other's teaching. They don't typically pluck out something and apply it in their setting. Barbara Walvert has said that kind of thing happens almost like reading somebody's autobiography or biography, where what you get is possibilities, inspiration, new ways of thinking, phrases that help you. One of the phrases I saw in one of the portfolios, one of the more recent portfolios, was about teaching rather than expecting learning. And I thought, wow, that really changes the temperature of the water. That's a big idea. I can take that.
So one of the ways in which I've used the portfolio, once we had a critical mass, we invite faculty members to identify a challenge, or if you don't want it to be a challenge, say, what do you want your students to do more of or to do better? And they will pose something like that. And if I know of a faculty member who's had an assignment like what they're talking about, I might say, well, go read this assignment. Or here's an innovation that somebody did to work on that. So they would start by reading the part of the portfolio that was addressing the interest they had in having their students do something better. They don't have to be, they're not written to be linear. They're written to be dived in and played around in. Are many of the research articles that I read over my career that had the biggest impact on me were not things I found by going through the library with search terms. It was a colleague who said, boy, I read this article, it's really interesting. And so word of mouth within a teaching community, have you read Holly's portfolio? Have you read the classics portfolio where they made that transition? If you wanted to know what students are learning, looking at a good course portfolio would be a terrific way to do it.
And you could create a program portfolio. That same process of inquiry and innovation and then the next round of inquiry could work at multiple levels. So yes, assessment at its best